Hello. All right, we'll wait for people to come on. We have about 50 people registered today, so we'll see how many make it in. But so far, hello and welcome everybody. You guys are muted, which I'm sorry for, but feel free to put in the chat where you are connecting from and perhaps how you know either of us. Love to see who this community is. And we'll just wait maybe one more minute for the rest of the audience to come on in. All right. I hope everyone is having a really nice Monday. We'll get started. My name is Yng-Ru Chen, and I am the founder and CEO of Praise Shadows Art Partners. It is a strategic and media advisory for culture. And I have worked in various capacities with all three of our guests today. Some I've known a lot longer, some I've known for a couple of years, but what's great is that all four of us are friends. We are peers and we are friends. And that's why I thought this would be such an interesting conversation to have, because we've been having these personal dialogues amongst us over the last few years about the roles and the potential of audiences for young and emerging Asian and Asian American artists. We all work very globally. And so I just thought this would be a great opportunity for us to have a dialogue in front of all of you, people who are interested and people who also know perhaps Shah's practice or James's practice or Sarah's practice. But for those who just joined, welcome. We're gonna get started in just a minute. So again, my name is Ing. I am the founder and CEO of Praise Shadows Art Partners. I'm currently based in Boston. I'd love to know where you are coming from. So go ahead and put it in the chat. And I wanted to also just put out there, I think we are all familiar now with Zoom etiquette, but please keep yourselves muted and use the chat to communicate with me if you have any issues or if you have any questions. We're just here to be respectful towards the artist and the curator who are giving us their time. And I also wanted to say that in the States, at least, May is Asian Pacific American Heritage Month. And, you know, it's always been one of those things where you're a member of a minority group and you're like, okay, now May, it's my time. Well, we're using May to kick off this dialogue and this conversation, but really, you know, in this time of great xenophobia and racism, especially towards Asian Americans, I thought this was a vital time to have some of these conversations too. So I love seeing where you guys are all coming from. Thank you so much. I'm going to start by reading briefly the bios of our three participants. And then the way that this is going to go is Sara Raza will take over as our moderator, and she will start with a session 10 minutes with James Clar, and James will share some of his work through a slideshow, and then we'll shift to Shahpour, and he's going to do the same. And then we'll have a conversation amongst the four of us afterwards, which will be, you know, questions initiated by myself and by Sarah. And then the last 10 minutes we'll have an audience Q&A through chat. So here we go. All right, I'm going to introduce Sara Raza first. Sarah was born in London. Actually, one more cool thing is that all three of them were born in the same exact year, which was a coincidence, but everyone is from 1979. So there's something in that year where these global thinkers, yeah, good year, I guess. Sara Raza is an award-winning curator and writer, and formerly the Guggenheim UBS Map Curator for the Middle East and North Africa. Her art and visual culture studio, Punk Orientalism, focuses on global art, publishing, and public programs, exploring ideas around nonconformity and resistance that are analogous to punk movements, coupled with a fresh analysis into the symptoms of Orientalism, largely from a post-Soviet lens. Sarah was also my intern at the Asian Society so many years ago, and that is how we know each other. I've known her since she was like fresh out of undergrad or her first master's program. So we are long, long friends. And it was Sara who introduced me to these two artists. So first I met James Clar. And James is a light and technology artist whose work focuses on the effects of technology on our perception of culture, nationality, and identity. His interest is in new technology and production processes and their use in developing conceptual narratives. He works from New York and Manila, although he is currently in Wisconsin. And then I met Shahpour, who was born in Iran. And Shah creates artwork that seeks to transform historical or political issues into a monument of poetic and visual form. His recent works and projects are influenced by science, archaeology, and the poetry of architectural forms that bridge past and present. He is currently based in New York. So with that, I am going to hand it over to Sara, and she can get started with James Clar.
Good morning, everybody. Hello. Thank you so much, Ing and James and Shahpour for this wonderful conversation. As Ing mentioned, she's brought us all together to sort of rethink or sort of reimagine what it means to be both Asian and both Western, both American, or in my case, European, and to sort of rethink how artists are sort of grappling with this dual space, if you like. I like to think of it as a third space of sorts. And what is most interesting is, as Ing mentioned, we're all old friends. You know, we all know one another as both peers and also professionally as well. I've curated both the work of James Clar as well as Shahpour Pouyan as well, throughout a different contexts, as well as public programming, talks, and text-based work as well. So it's quite interesting that we've come together to sort of think through this sort of challenging moment in our history, but also how our respective practices speak to that. And without further ado, I'm going to sort of start by thinking through this idea. I mean, I want to sort of dismantle what it means to be both other and one at the same time, and sort of multi-hyphenated identities, and how this can be very problematic. And in some cases, it can also be very refreshing as well. And what's most interesting here is how we sort of think through. I mean, I'm somebody, as Ing mentioned, who looks at one Asia looking at another Asia. I mean, my interest is in Middle East and Central Asia. So for me, both ethnically and my own being both Iranian and Central Asian is always a way to sort of look through myself, but also the artist. So it's a dialogue that's happening inside Asia. And it's happening when it's outside with people from the diaspora. So that's one way of sort of thinking about things. It's no longer this sort of East-West dynamic. It's much more complex than that. And then we sort of think about a third way, if you like, is to start imagining technology and to sort of think about ideas that we look at East, West, and tech. It's sort of three navigational paths of how we sort of go about traversing our connections and our practices. So I really want to sort of start with James with that respect, because he's forged fascinating practice that sort of brings together technological works, but also provides a sort of human angle. That interactive piece is very important to your practice. So James, I wanted to speak to you about that. And given your educational background as well, having looked at most recently for your master's degree and what we were working on together, several proposals as well, that sort of marry this new language or this new way in which we sort of navigate this digital space. And that's something beyond geography, and that's really, really interesting. But then again, there are other sort of aspects that are coming into this when we're sort of thinking about technology and thinking about Asia's role within that, and the role of how information is transferred, filtered, and sort of absorbed internationally as well. And then again, how it's also disseminated. So I wanted to speak to you a little bit about that. And also, one thing is for sure, that I wanted to mention this book that we're both reading concurrently right now. It's called Techno-Orientalism. So there's the technology piece, and I actually took this from the Rubin Library. I have to return it at some point. I know one of my ex-colleagues is there watching. So the idea is that it looks at both technology and Orientalism. And Orientalism is, of course, the practice of how the West imagines the East. And it was obviously made very popular by the popular intellectual Edward Said in his groundbreaking book, 1978 book, Orientalism. But in this respect, it sort of looks at how Asia's rise is occurring through technology, through both the way in which walls have been covered, the recent globalization, the industrial sort of rise is being looked at, particularly in the case of China. It looks at the Arab Spring in the recent years, post what happened in Egypt and in Tunisia. So it's very, very interesting that it's looking at all these different technological realms. And I think, James, I want to bring it back to you that you've developed this really interesting language within your work as a sort of third way. And I wanted you to talk a little bit about that. And I know you're going to also share some images with us.
Yeah. Do I go straight into the slideshow and the images, or?
But we can also have a chat over it.
Yeah, so so my background is, I'm a first generation Filipino American. My parents immigrated in the 60s. They first went to, from the Philippines in Manila, they went to Montreal, then to Boston, and then in Wisconsin, where I was born and raised. So it's kind of an odd kind of trajectory into the arts and within my own practice. The town that I grew up in was like only 20,000 people. I was the only Filipino, Asian student in my whole high school. So this idea of like kind of being other was kind of, something that kind of I grew up with, and trying to understand like cultural identity is something that's been kind of a continual process. So then I went to New York, for film and animation, and then graduate school at ITP. I lived in Tokyo for 2 years, Dubai for 6 years, and then now back to New York. And then now I'm going to move my practice again to Manila to kind of investigate more about kind of my own cultural background and kind of the information systems that are there in the Philippines and how that kind of influences, Filipinos' view on themselves and their own culture. But, I'm interested a lot in like kind of information systems and visual systems and how that kind of influence your view of yourself or your view of other people, because a lot of it's just information itself. You could have been born, like I could have been born somewhere else in a different city or a different country. Biologically, I'm the same person, but I would have radically different ideas of who I am or who other people are. And this is all just done through like media technology, film, pop culture. I'm interested in kind of technology and how that's kind of progresses these ideas or influences like kind of cultural aspects or individuality.
James, and also the fact that you've had studio practices in different countries. And we actually met in Dubai when you were there for your 6-year stint, so that's really, really interesting. So these sort of diverse cultural topographies really sort of add value to your practice and the way in which you sort of explore the technological realm within those particular societies is sort of very fascinating. Perhaps you could talk a little bit about that as well.
Yeah, I think all the places that I've been to, I've also, you get used to being in other, but also at the same time, it allows you to kind of stay outside of kind of the cultural pressures of like, assimilation. You just kind of observe things and like how people are, especially in Dubai. Dubai was like, I was there from 2006 to 2012. So these are kind of formative years of the arts and culture scene there too. So everyone there is like from, they're from Brazil, they're from Germany, they're from Iran. And we're all there because of globalism and because of the internet. I don't think like Dubai would have been around or would have developed if the internet wasn't there and kind of showcasing all these kind of architectural projects and, how quickly the city was developing. But, people there are just, they're there immediately. And so the idea of like, who are we or what does it mean to be somebody from Dubai or living in a city where at that time there's really little happening culturally, so you're really kind of putting you're kind of involved in the kind of discussion of what it means to be in a certain place at a certain time and what does it mean to be as an outsider. And even for like people from Dubai, Emiratis, they're the minority. So what does it mean to be in a country where your own country where you're a local but you're a minority in that country? So it was an interesting kind of discussion, and you see like kind of the influence of like how culture, like arts and culture, kind of disseminates into kind of social practices or way people behave.
And you mentioned something very interesting when you spoke about the idea of the internet. And obviously, we're all the same generation. So we all got the internet around when we were 16, 17 years old, around about that time. And it sort of changed everything at that point. That idea of that multicultural period of the 90s, there was so much really interest in connecting, and sort of the hard work had been done by many of the artists from the 60s in terms of civil rights and so forth. So the 90s, like particularly like late 90s and going into that period was a really exciting moment when the internet was also available. And then we entered this sort of 9/11 moment with this hyper surveillance. And, you know, the fact that connectivity was sort of seen as a sort of tool that could be infiltrated, it was seen as something sinister. There was a huge backlash against globalization at that period. And that was really interesting because that was a moment when you graduated. Same myself, I also graduated and I was working, I was writing, I was curating. There was a really interesting shift in how connectivity sort of worked and how that was sort of being surveyed, if you like. Both
Yeah. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Exactly. Sorry, were being surveyed both online and offline. So that, you know, online, offline component became sort of really interesting space as well to sort of think through.
Yeah, I mean, it was yeah, definitely like growing up in the 90s or going through high school and then entering college as the internet was just kind of forming. You know, this idea, this kind of liberal fantasy of like free information was, you know, exhilarating. And then you see it kind of being kind of commodified, and you see this kind of underbelly of like where that information is going to. So it's interesting to see this kind of shift over from something that was like kind of altruistic or gonna like liberate people into something that the mechanics of like kind of control started to kind of form in there.
I think so. And let's show some of your images now so we can sort of think through some of the ideas that we're discussing today.
Let's see. Okay, so Ing, I need to, I'll share my screen.
So James is going to share some images that we're just going to speak over to sort of get the discussion going as well.
Let's see. I need to have, Ing, you need to, I think you have to allow me to share screen. Okay. All right. Hold on a second.
So James,
that's
your recent work in Manila when you went back with the Silver Lens Gallery.
Yeah, that's correct. So in the last like couple of years, year and a half, I've been going to the Philippines, and I'm working now with Silver Lens Gallery there, and I've been kind of immersing myself. This is Shahpour's. Yeah. Yeah, so this is images from the studio. This is kind of in preparation. This is in New York, in Brooklyn. So we're preparing for an exhibition at Untitled Miami. It was a solo booth, but you know, all the works were kind of based on properties of water or properties of liquids. And I became interested in kind of weather as a medium and kind of translating kind of physical world into like digital systems or light systems. So each of these pieces kind of takes like a different aspect of liquid or water or light reacting to it, and then kind of translating that into kind of sculptural light. And this is kind of one of the main kind of components of my practice is these kind of light, sculptural light works. Because I was film-based, then instead of using film is a light medium, then I started kind of segueing into controlling light itself or using projectors, a light medium into kind of sculptural mediums.
And if you move to the interactive piece.
Who's controlling, actually, is Ing controlling this, or is it, are you?
I'm not sure who's controlling it. Somebody else.
So this is a piece that is, hold on. I think Ing is controlling it on her computer because she's hosting the talk, so I think only she can.
Ing is manipulating the screen.
This is called a moment defined by a point in a line. Yeah. And what it is, it's actually, the piece is the piece on the right, which is a clear acrylic block with a light intersecting through it. And this is actually a series that had started in Dubai. And what it is it takes a historical assassination, and then it shows the point of entry of the bullet and the angle of trajectory, depending on the person. So this is Ninoy Aquino. And he was assassinated as he came back to Manila. His assassination kind of triggered off protests and led to the EDSA revolution. It led to the ousting of Marcos. And it kind of, you know, I'm thinking about these kind of critical moments in time and how the mathematics of that bullet, how that it can be distilled into kind of just kind of pure mathematic. And so now, you know, we have like right now Duterte is there, and he's kind of lineage from that. You know, they just sold, he just like shut down ABS-CBN, which is the largest news network there. So these kind of like kind of domino effects of, you know, what had happened at that kind of critical point in time.
That's interesting though, because that's also under this current regime in the Philippines is sort of a mirroring, because he often cites that the media is an enemy, and that's something we're hearing all the time in the US, you know.
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, there's a lot of like kind of parallels between them and us. And a lot of my friends there are like worried about like martial law being reinstated, especially with like, you know, the shutdown of ABS-CBN. And his war against media is like kind of a big thing that's also, you know, Trump is always doing.
Exactly. So like they often say, like when America sneezes, the whole world catches a cold. And I think this is like a domino effect of this sort of rise of this dictator idea that we're sort of seeing all over the world, and we're not escaping it. It's not something exclusive just to the United States. And that's interesting because that affects obviously the way in which artists sort of choose to respond. And it brings us to this work, because this work is quite an interesting one. That is a...
Sorry, go ahead.
James, could you speak a little bit about?
Yeah. So this is a series. It's called Nobody's Home, and I took a door. I found like a local craftsman in Manila and sourced this door. I hollowed out the insides and then placed this kind of light system inside the bottom edge of the door. The light is then, it's an LED linear array. It's playing video of myself and my studio assistant walking around. But then it's just kind of taking one roll of that video and then playing it underneath the door. So what you get is this kind of sense of like a space or a person on the other side of the door. It's kind of a virtual space or a kind of a spiritual space. It's about like, I mean, film is about like perception and reality. And so this is kind of like a sculptural film setting.
Yes, and I think that sort of encapsulates your practice quite a lot, this idea of this third space, this digital space, unknown space. It has a really interesting way to sort of dissolve the barriers of them and us, East, West. And I think your practice really is a sort of astute example of that, somebody who sort of goes beyond this geographical sort of remit. And
yeah, I mean, it is like a lot of it's based on like kind of language of film.
Yeah.
And so you think about like kind of human perception, and film is like this kind of like universal language. And so it's like very technological, but a lot of the times it has to do with kind of our own like human emotions or like our experience, you know.
Great, thank you so much, James. I think that to keep ease of time, that we should sort of bring Shahpour back into the conversation. So James, you're free to mute yourself until we're doing the question component of the discussion. So Shahpour, we're sort of going to go back a few millennia now with you, a few millennia back to the ancient time, because this is something we always talk about, is that your interest in sort of marrying the ancient and the contemporary. As a contemporary artist, you're very much a contemporary artist, but what you have done is forged a practice that sort of brings back, you know, looks at the past within the present context. And that's something that sort of united us as friends as well. When I first came to your work, I was introduced by Asma Al-Shabibi. She's here, I saw her. She is your gallerist a few years ago to sort of learn about your practice. And it was interesting that we were both living in New York and I didn't know about that at that time. So that's something really interesting about the idea of the void. And I know that you've studied both in Iran, you studied mathematics and later fine art, and then you finished your education here in the United States at Pratt. And, you know, studied in two different diverse contexts. And that's something I wanted to talk to you about a little bit, to sort of understand that how that experience helped mold your career, because you came here as a postgraduate student. So you'd already established yourself as an artist in Iran and then came here to sort of finish your education. So maybe you could talk a little bit about that, Shahpour. We want you to sort of speak through this sort of understanding, because for James and I and Ing, our experience has been very different. We've sort of lived in Europe and North America for the majority of our lives. You know, I was actually born here, James was born here as well. But with you, you came at a later age, you know, already developed in terms of.
Well, I mean, it was very interesting. I didn't know we are all were born in 1979, which is amazing. I think it's a great year with all the, I think, the changes and shifts that happened in the political scene of the world, especially the revolution in Iran, the invasion of Afghanistan, and then I mean many other things that happened. So yes, so that's the time that I was born, the first months of the revolution in Iran, and after that, my childhood, the whole 8 years was during the Iran-Iraq war. So it was a very unique experience to just grow up in a country that you think everything is normal, but in reality, nothing is normal there. So, because I lived in Iran for almost 30 years, so when I came to America, that was the time that I learned about the differences between a normal American or Western life and what we had in our childhood. The fear, the sense of terror, and then after that, the 30 years sanctions, you know. It's very interesting. I mean, the very different identity that we know about ourselves as an Iranian, for example, but then you come to America and then you go to school and you get a very different label that you wouldn't experience it before in your life, and then it suddenly is you are someone else, and you have a set of labels that describing you, your personality, your fundamental beliefs, and everything, and your language, race, and religion, and I mean, it's quite. I mean, I can say annoying to just have this experience, and so in the first phase for me was I was trying to educate people, to just telling them like who I am, where I'm coming from, and why you don't understand. I mean, it was weird for me. They don't understand the differences between different ethnicities in the region, the Iranian, the Arabs, the Turks, the Pakistanis. We are all like we are all old people with a very solid identity, languages, structure of cultures, and so that was, I would say, the first thing I was confronted.
And may I interject? I think that the best way to sort of talk through this point about this complexity of identity would be if we looked at the work as well. Because the body of work that you're going to discuss really sort of encapsulates this idea.
Yes.
Sort of about this idea that we talk about a lot, that, you know, as others, you're exotic, you're unknown, you're dangerous. You know, there are all these sort of conjured up ideas that sort of come to this idea.
It's very interesting. I think, I'm going to start it with that. But first I mean, all the time, many times I just go back to this book. I think it's like a very important Orientalism by Said. I think it's like a Bible if you want to get more understanding of the region we come from. I mean, and the book starts with a very interesting quote from Karl Marx in the first page that it said that they cannot represent themselves, they must be represented. So it's a quote from Karl Marx, the 18th Beaumaire of Louis Bonaparte. So it's just a good, you know, introduction to where we are gonna go. So we are talking about the people who are exotic, who are not basically understanding exactly what we're talking about. Let me see. First, if anyone can see the page now. Okay. So so here I started with.
I think it's important to say that you've been working in ceramics for the last, you know,
yes,
5 years.
So so the first two things that I learned about my experience of life in Iran and America is the meaning of being exotic, which I didn't know what it means to be exotic. And then the other one was the complexity of experiencing of experience of war and PTSD. So there were two interesting things that I learned during my education in Pratt. And when Pratt finished, I was working on the project regarding the identity and the exotism and Orientalism. So I started with a set of drawings that we can see here, which is somehow also is inspired by the poem by Jamie McKendrick. It's a British poet, which I love his works. And the poem is ancient history. So it's talking about the tribes that are coming from the east and their rumors about how they're going to invade the west. So it's very interesting, and the ambiguity of these people, the structure of their tribal structure and all these things. So from that, I started doing these drawings that in the first phase, I did these drawings that are more explicit in form, the letters, and also the decoration. So it's like a Oriental projectile, and but then little by little it got more ambiguous. So I got to this one, which is, for example, another one with this unclear function. And
study to then perform a series of ceramic works too.
Yes, so from here, from all the drawings, I got to the more, abstract forms, such as like this drawing. So, which is not clear what is the object, what's the function, what's the reason behind the production of this object. So it also have this Orientalist taste.
The sensibility of Orientalism, yes.
Yeah, taste in drawing. It's like when the Orientalists, they had all these travels around the East. They had like sketchbooks, and these are the type of technique they use in their drawing. So
like an anthropological element to it. Like
sorry.
Anthropological element.
Yes, exactly. But then in the deepest, in a deeper layer, I was looking to the images, such as, for example, the Baghdad battery, which is still a very controversial object that we don't know what is the function, but it's supposed to be a battery that made electricity, but it's from 1,000 years ago. It was, I think it's from 1900 or 1800 years ago.
I think it's a bit before that, actually, this piece, because between 8th and 14th century is when most of these inventions were being sort of created, but the exact date is unknown.
This is pre-Islamic.
Okay.
And then so I was looking to the object, the complexity of the shape, and also the puzzle that it made in your mind, that why people practice this science or this technology. And again, regarding the approach we have to the East is always respecting the science and technology, but at the same time the fear regarding the people with disability and this crazy wisdom, crazy, I would say, intelligence. So I try to just bring them in a context of the drawings and making this.
That's really interesting that you bring those ideas together, because we were talking about this a few days ago, that you are obviously nostalgic in your practice, but very progressive at the same time, because you're not looking at it from this perspective that, 1,000 years ago, we were the founders of science and mathematics. We were rewriting everything the Crusades had destroyed. The Arabs and the Persians were really rewriting history at one period, particularly, during this moment that they were sort of continuing with the work of what the Greeks had started. But you sort of approach it in a really interesting way, from a contemporary angle, from a contemporary perspective, that looks and draws on all these ambiguities. Whether it's through drawing or whether it's through your ceramic, you sort of continue this dialogue and you don't take a political position, which is really important. And I really want to stress that artists aren't politicians. They're here to sort of expand the way we look at the world, to provide alternative lens, what is real or what is alternatively real, but they're not here to give us definitive answers. And I think that's also key.
I mean, at some point in my art practice, I realized that, I mean, as an artist, I don't have an obligation to educate people. I just have an obligation to confuse people more and more. So it's like my approach to just making something more controversial and just trying to give something that no one can decode it. And the beauty and poetry of the objects is that you can understand them. Exactly. So, and I think that's very important to just do some, because I think it's like, for example, there was an exhibition in Met a couple of years ago. It was about the objects that bought by the curators in the early 20th century from Syria, Iran, Iraq, and they're supposed to be antiques from prehistoric era. But in reality, they found out these objects, they are all made in 20th and 19th century by the craftsmen from the region. They knew that these curators, they're gonna come to take them for their, you know, collection. So they got a little piece from a jar from 2,000 years ago, and based on that, they made a new object, and then the new object sold to them as a real object. So I quite love the idea that there was a practice of deceiving people and just making this imagination. So they were a real artist at that moment of the time, and that confusion is pretty poetic and beautiful for me.
I think so. And I think also, no, that's beautiful. I like this idea of provenance and this sort of blurring of that. But Shahpour, I'm also cognizant of the time, because I want us to have a larger dialogue with the four of us, that if you kindly, you know, swiftly move through this. Okay. And to the next point.
So in this regard, I'm just going to show these two pieces that, I mean, they call them the spheroconical objects, and they are in all different collections of Near Asian art. And when they found them, first they thought that these are the objects that they used to be a grenade, like they called them ancient grenades, because they couldn't understand the function and the reason behind making this object. So. But later, this hypothesis are rejected, because these objects, they have decoration. So if you want to use a grenade, who's going to decorate it if you're going to use it as a grenade? But the very interesting thing for me was the misunderstanding of the object and the culture, that it getting to the point that you think they are the grenade, so you can't imagine any other function for the object, and that's what you suggest for it. So then from that, I'm just gonna jump to the more images. So in the next phase, I did the objects that are hollow ceramics and terracottas, and they look quite ancient. And basically you can't have access to inside the objects except the very tiny holes that is impossible to pour or to fill the objects or anything. So it just gives you more ambiguity about the date of the production of the objects, the reason behind the production, and the functionality of the piece. So
I don't have a particular reference. If you sort of go back just to give context to these, that they, you know, in the early 20th century, the British Museum enacted an excavation in Iran, in ancient Iran, of Mesopotamian land, former Mesopotamian land, and they excavated the Cyrus Cylinder.
Yeah.
And these are sort of based on that. I know you have an image of that.
Yeah, I'm just running over to trying to show more images. And
before we come to this, can we just show the audience the Cyrus Cylinder, so we sort of understand the context of those?
Of course, yes. So this is the Cyrus Cylinder, and is also a very interesting piece, because there is a lot of controversy around it. But this is many people, they believe this is the first example of human rights that is written and recorded in history.
It's 500 BC, correct?
Yes, 500 BC from the Achaemenid era. So when Cyrus invaded Babylon.
And it's really interesting because we were talking about identity in this sort of discussion, but this one, it's in cuneiform, and some of it's been sort of translated by historians, and
Yeah.
it sort of looks at the idea of human rights, because it mentions the rights of women. It
Yes.
mentions that the home of the Jews is Iran. This was like the period of, you know, in Iran has a multiplicity of diversity of races, and the, you know, Esther's tomb is in Hamadan in Iran, you know, Queen Esther. And it's very interesting sort of history. It looks at the Judaic history in Iran as well. And it also said that the Jews were always welcome in Iran. And it also mentions about women and men. And we were talking about this, and most people don't know this, but in the Persian language, we don't have any gender. We don't have masculine, feminine. We only have u, which is both men, woman, and it. It goes for masculine and feminine gender. So that's so when we talk about identity, we're already coming from a land where historically there was no separation between men and women. You know, we had dynasties where women were queens, and you know, women were given such an important role, and that infiltrated into language. And so when we come from a society which is so progressive historically, obviously things took a wrong turn in the recent years, that women were sort of demoted after the Iranian Revolution of '79, but our language didn't even have gender. So when we talk about identity, East, West, racial identity, we can go back to the origin of it. We don't, you know, the most core man, woman, human identity was considered as one. So these are all really interesting points that go back to the ancient that you explore in the contemporary. And then Shahpour, I know that I have to be sort of a bit strict with our time because it's 11:42 here in New York, that we only have just over 15 minutes. That based on that concept of identity, that we move on to your most recent work, which was featured in Clapping with Stones at the Rubin Museum, which was a graduation from a project that you started in 2014. And I want to hand it over to you to describe the complexity and richness of this work.
Well, that's, I mean, I'm going to be very quick. So, so the project started when I did a DNA test back in 2014 or 15. And then the result was quite shocking because I had background ethnicity from Central Asia, South Asia, Middle East, Caucasus Mountains, and then North Europe and British Isles. So it was like so all over the place. And I grew up in an Iranian family, so both my parents are Iranian, but I was aware of the racial diversity of my family. And that was the main reason I wanted to do the test, because I knew my grandmother was like, she had completely Asian features, and my grandfather was completely white, and then my mom's side were very classical Persian. So I was like, okay, this is interesting to see where all these ties coming from. So so based on that, I started studying on the architectures of that regions, and I got to the list of 33 countries that my genetic backgrounds come from. But through the years, I got more updates, and it shrank to 15 countries. And the British Isle is not there anymore. And very interesting, the Middle East is not there anymore. But instead, I got Korean Peninsula and Manchuria. And so based on this new information, I updated the project. That first time I showed it in Dubai, in Gallery Lari Shabibi, which was a 33 domes on a cubic structure. For this exhibition, I did 15 sculptures, and each one representing most memorable or more celebrated forms of practicing dome or ceiling in each of the countries that I found in my DNA test. And somehow I'm celebrating the history of power and monument in that countries. So so for example, here I have Armenia, I have Norway and Iran. And
right to left.
Oh yes, left Iran, the middle is Armenia, and the right one is in Norway. So they are just representing different approach to aesthetic regarding practicing monument and power, or I would say national ego. So so yeah, and then all the objects, they contain the ash, which is representing what we leave behind. So they are like a dead shells of civilization that they they come to life and they leave the life. So they are like a butterflies after their death. So that was my way to celebrating what we call history or heritage.
Wonderful.
And how is so deep in our DNA, and how is basically impossible to understand it, and how is impossible for other people to understand your identity, your background, or your anything as a heritage, such as race, such as.
Yeah, through the art of abstraction, you were able to sort of grapple with that idea.
Yeah.
I think that sort of encapsulates so much about your practice as well, how you use abstract forms intentionally. And I think this will be an interesting point now. Thank you so much, Shahpour, for giving us a detailed analysis of these two bodies of work and sort of how they come back to our context of our discussion today. So thank you for that.
Thank you.
And we'll bring back Ing and our audience.
Thank you all so much. I've seen both of your work in many different contexts and in different periods, and I'm always fascinated by the fact that the two of you, James and Shahpour, have a friendly but artist-driven dialogue, and yet the two of you are working in such different kinds of media. Sara, I was going to ask a question to start this, but I actually think we can just go into what they're doing, because it's so interesting. Because you're both, as Sara just said, you're both working in abstraction in many ways. But with James, it's in technology, it's in light, it's in a totally different form from what Shahpour is doing. How do the two of you, when you have these conversations, how do you guys address it? Do you often find that you're talking about identity, or do you find that it's, are there other common core areas that are more essential to what you two talk about?
James, you want to go?
Yeah, so I think for my practice, a lot of it's kind of narrative driven. So I'm interested in kind of storylines and how to convey, concepts or emotions or stories through technology, and how that kind of affects our own perception of who we are, and then also other people's perception of who they are.
And that's probably largely driven from your background as a film student, would you say?
Correct.
Yeah.
Correct. Yeah. I mean, I think a lot of the processes, thinking about thinking about time and frame rates, and trying to break things down in terms of distance to time, or properties of light. A lot of that's based on 3D animation, and just trying to break down these kind of physical components or physics of light. Because in 3D environment, then you have to kind of replicate that. So you have to have kind of a fine grained understanding of how light and its properties work. But then I use those as kind of tool sets to kind of develop either a sculptural work or an installation.
Right. What about you, Shah? When you have conversations with James, what do you look to him for?
I think our conversation is because of the background regarding Dubai and the galleries, we always have conversation about the place. And also, I think the very interesting things that ties our conversation is the perceptions of others to us, which is very interesting I think for both of us. We just, somehow it's funny to just to have this conversation of how they look at my art, or how they look at James' art. And
when you say they, do you mean curators, collectors? Who do you mean?
I think mostly institutions, Western institutions, and the way that they pigeonhole you, as an
ethnic artist.
Ethnic artist in a very specific type of way. I never felt like I'm I never felt like I'm accepted as a New Yorker, an artist that who lives here for 10 years. I never been in any exhibition in America that is out of the context of being Iranian. So, and in any curators who worked with me was just regarding that. Yeah. So if there is anything about art in America, I'm not involved in it after a decade living in America.
Right. So despite living here for 10 years, you often feel that you're still looked upon as a foreign artist.
I always feel.
Yeah.
Yeah. So.
And Sarah, I mean, so your job at the Guggenheim, you had the mandate to collect for the institution art from the Middle East, which, as we all know, is a construct that is a whole other conversation, and also from North Africa. And when you finished collecting and your exhibition was open, and you finished the work, and then the position was over. That's how the role of the UBS map curators are set up. These curators are brought in for a period of time. They collect for a region so that the Guggenheim, a very Western institution, can have an East Asian collection, a collection from what you did, a South American collection. I mean, I know that it's a loaded question, but as you were preparing to look at artists and to look at what the Guggenheim would acquire, what was the process like for you, especially since you had just come from the UK at that point? You were relatively new to America. Were there any learning, or what did you learn in that process in terms of working with a US institution and collecting art from a foreign culture?
Well, Ing, to answer your question, working for a US institution isn't any dissimilar for working for a Western other. I mean, I've worked at Tate Modern, House de Culture and Development, which are very large institutions. I've also worked in the Middle East, but for the US, of course, its proximity was very interesting because it has a very interesting relationship to the region that I was looking at, the Middle East and North Africa. It's one that's of a neo-colonial relationship. It's through conflict, let's say, through war, it's through sanctions. It's a different sort of rhetoric to one that doesn't have that relationship to Europe, because Europe had a very strong colonial history with many countries that I was looking at the artists from. So US had a one removed, let's say. And it was really interesting. I want to bring something up quickly, is that when I was collecting work and researching artists, I was asked once, why are you looking at artists who are born in America and Europe, and living and working, in Europe and North America? Why aren't they all in the region? And I said, well, there is something called empire. There is something called colonialism. There's a reason that these artists live and work in Europe. There's a reason that they're in the United States, and they do contribute to academia. They contribute to visual culture. However, when their names don't roll off the tongue very easily, there's always considered, you might be born here, you might have lived here your whole life. Yet just that one piece is enough to sort of separate you. And it comes back to this hyphenated sort of understanding. In the United States, if you're not the dominant, you're a hyphen. You're Asian American, you're African American, you're, whatever, Native American. There's always this hyphenated sense. And that's always interesting. It's what we refer to as double consciousness,
right,
as well. And that's another conversation as well that comes into the work of Du Bois. But
yeah, I mean, I think colonialism is a big issue, as we talk. I mean, it's huge and loaded, but, Iran was not colonized by European power. And yet I think very few people would know that, because people in our society here seem to just, as Shah was saying, group it all together. And meanwhile, James with his heritage coming from the Philippines, that's loaded with American colonial influence. And I think it's interesting, James, that you are, spending more time in Manila after a childhood in Wisconsin, where you and your brothers and your mother and father and your sister, you guys were the only Asians in your vicinity, despite the fact that I believe it was your father or both your parents were the medical doctors for the community, right?
Yeah, my mom was a nurse also.
Right, so they were taking care of the community, and yet you were still looked upon as the others, the foreigners. So why don't you talk to us a little bit about your shift over these last few years to really looking towards Manila and establishing a practice there?
Yeah, it's been kind of a long trajectory to kind of make my way over there. I mean, it's like kind of similar to what Chai and I talk about in terms of being an other within the arts. And it's been interesting for myself just because, I mean, just even, you know, with my last name, Clar, a lot of people can't place me as Asian or Filipino. So it's been an odd thing where people know my work, but they don't place me as like an Asian artist necessarily. And also my work isn't overtly pushing these kind of like expected topics, you know, from the beginning. It was more just kind of approaching things in terms of light and understanding like what we see and what it means and how to manipulate that. Things have kind of shifted over more into the cultural heritage in the last few years. Just kind of making my way from Dubai and then working west through Europe and into the States, and then now further west into Asia. I think, yeah, that has been just like a slow shift, something that wasn't forced, but it's just kind of the path that had led me there. You know, when I was in Dubai, I was there for like 6 years, and you know, I was really kind of an active participant in the arts and culture scene there. I had a huge studio. I'd host like, you know, installations and kind of help out with the scene there. But it was also like really difficult being there as like an American or Filipino American who wasn't necessarily, you know, from the region, you know. So you start to observe these things where, you know, art is so progressive in terms of like the ideas that it pushes, but also can be really kind of traditionalist in terms of who gets to talk about those ideas. You know, who's allowed to talk about issues from the Middle East? Is it only Middle Easterners or people who have like a Middle Eastern last name? I was living there, you know, for 6 years, and a lot of shows that were put on about that region, about the development of that region, you know, a lot of those artists were just, you know, of Middle Eastern background, but they're living in the States or living in Canada or London or, you know, in Europe. But I was actually, you know, I was actually physically there. And it's just like something you observe. It's just like kind of how, I don't know, like these narratives that are kind of developed for exhibitions.
Right.
And also like, how is it easier for the public to kind of disseminate that kind of information too? Like, is it invalid for somebody who's a Filipino American to talk about, you know, issues that were happening during the Arab Spring, you know? So I mean, the trajectory just started kind of shifting more and more towards Asia.
Yeah. Okay.
And somebody's
I'm gonna unmute you.
Yeah, so the conversation or everything's just kind of shifted more towards Asia and trying to understand that kind of aspect of myself and of that region, and trying to, you know, take my practice of like kind of observing like information systems, similar to what I was doing in Dubai or even in the States, and then now in Asia.
Cool. So we have about 7 or 8 minutes for questions. We have one question from Jenna Weber. She says, I've lived here as an Asian adoptive and also felt like an outside, no matter how familiar the relations are. Do you feel that your art was a solution or a recipe to help them understand the differences you feel? Either one of you want to take that?
For me, I think, as I mentioned before, I think history is confusion. I mean, the whole human history is just misunderstanding. So I don't think I try to fix anything. I mean, maybe my friends, they could, you know, have a different perception of my country, but I can't change or I can't do anything regarding the way that my country or like my people or in a bigger, you know, bigger geography, Middle East misrepresented. Like, for example, Iraq, you know, like for no reason, but just by a very weird, no, without any documents regarding the chemical weapons, there was a most destructive war of the end of century happening in Iraq. I mean, how an artist could help for that, you know, just impossible.
We have one question from, did you want to say something else, Shah? No? We have a question from Huma Kabachi. She says, this question is for everyone in a way, which is more related to the current situation. Do we have any new ways in which traveling, physical mobility, and presence in certain geographical contexts could support socially and ecologically sustainable artistic practices? How can we rethink the way how contemporary art operates within the interconnectedness of the local and the international, for example, in the context of the biennial? What does it mean, art from the diaspora, in the context of now, with issues around closing of borders? Sarah, do you want to take that?
Yeah, thank you, Huma. How are you? So that's a great question, two questions within one. And to answer the first one, the fact that we have a very low carbon footprint right now, right, with our COVID-19 situation, is that we're already sort of inadvertently contributing to this idea of sustainability and a more eco-friendly sort of way in which we travel. I mean, us in the art world, we're sort of held guilty to the amount of carbon and the footprints that we leave behind when we travel so much. And I know there are artists who have always gone against that, you know, Tino Segel being one of the great examples. He travels by train or by boat. And now we're forced to sort of find new ways of connectivity, using the internet, for example, using other sort of more alternative means. I'm not suggesting that we, you know, communicate through pigeon or something. You know, we do have the tools in the 21st century to be able to sort of go beyond and sort of rethink how we do communicate. But in terms of diaspora, I mean, we all know that the nature of borders is arbitrary. It does worry me a little bit with this current situation, is that if it turns into something else, then these borders that are sort of at the moment protecting us from this virus can sort of become borders that protect us from other things as well, more imaginary viruses. And I know we've spoken about this before within the group as well, through Ing's recent series of talks as well. So that's a bit worrying in terms of that. But I do think anybody, okay, I'll say it, that you live in the diaspora, you speak more than one language, fantastic. You're thinking more than one brain, fantastic. Now, how can any of that be, you know, wrong? Eddie, you have 2 passports, sometimes even 3. You have studios in more than one country. This is most definitely amazing. Already you have that idea of multiplicity there, being able to think in more than one brain. And for me, this is nothing but positive. I can never see it as a hindrance. A hindrance to what? To being singular, to having a one-track brain, being only able to see the world through one vision. Being of multiple or mixed ethnicity or being of dual ethnicity is surely a positive thing. It can never, ever be something. I mean, it's a hindrance or it's a sort of threat to those who can only think in one mode, right? It's always been that way throughout history. Anybody that represents the other, anybody who represents more than one way of thinking is all often sort of seen as a threat.
Of course.
And it must be sort of controlled. It's a control issue as well. Mm-hmm. And that sort of comes back to insecurities of multiple sort of lenses. You know, it can be financial insecurity, it can be other forms as well. And we sort of see that now with this rhetoric around Asia in particular. It's Asia right now, India, it's China right now. Who knows what it's going to be in the future? It was Iraq, it was Iran. It sort of goes through different scapegoats. And, you know, there are financial implications to that. It isn't just purely geographical, purely related to this virus. It has a much, much wider implication as well. Exactly.
Yeah, thank you so much. We'll take one more question. This is from Momo, and this is actually a really good way of me directing the question that I was going to end with all of you. But the question is, how can we actively build and expand more platforms for the Asian American artist community? And the question that I was going to ask all 3 of them to end this session was to say, how are you looking at taking active steps to combat the rhetoric or to address the racism and xenophobia or the ways that the other has always been directed at you? Art has always been a reflection of our times and of our society. And with all 3 of you, you know, your jobs are putting visual culture on the map. So let's start with you, James. Do you have you thought of any kind of active steps that you yourself can take to address this?
Well, I mean, I think what I'm doing personally is exploring a lot, like in Manila and in the Philippines. And I think working with those kind of narratives and kind of bringing those back and exposing those is also kind of a step towards bringing more awareness towards what is going on there. So for my own practice and in terms of like the path that I'm going down, it's a lot of that is kind of mining and unearthing kind of like cultural aspects of my background and kind of tying that into my practice.
Thank you. Shahpour?
It's a very difficult question. I don't know if I have any answers for it, to be honest. I think the best way is just focusing on our practice, I guess. I don't think I can't help that unless I'm just helping to the community or even the artists or the students in Iran. So I have a friend that he has a school, art school in Tehran, and instead of teaching, Western art, he teaches Persian Islamic geometry from medieval era. So they sitting in a class and they solving geometry puzzles that been around since like 10th century. And so every time I go back to Iran, we sit and solving geometry questions from, this mathematics from that era. And I think this is the way to bring back the geometry of, like, for example, Islamic art, Persian art that use in architecture. Mm-hmm. So I think just going back to roots. I never get fed up with history. I think history is the most amazing way to go back to just digging more material. And I think if we're going to change something, I think it's better to change something in the institution and structure in the countries that we are coming from. So I think it's very helpful.
Interesting. Thank you so much.
Mm-hmm.
Sara Raza, do you have any last parting words or thoughts on this question?
I think it's an excellent question. I think Shahpour and James answered it excellently, but I think the answer was there already. It's a sort of rhetorical question, right? To a creative person, how do you solve a situation that you didn't create, right? You're just creating your work. It's not one for us to perhaps solve. It's for as you rightly said, for the institution, for the other to sort of decipher and try to sort of deconstruct, because we can't really solve racism if we haven't. I mean, it's a two-way street, of course, but it's not one for us to sort of answer. Mm-hmm. It's of course we have an obligation to ourselves first and foremost, and we do have an obligation as artists and creative workers, historians, so forth. But it's a dialogue. It can never be a monologue, right?
No, I agree. I think for me, what I would love to see is just more collaboration between artists who are interested in raising each other's voices, artworks. And in terms of an actual platform, that could be an institution that decides to take that on. It could be all of us who decide to take that on. Now with this virtual world, who knows how much longer we'll be in it. But I'm sure that as we emerge from COVID-19, what we're doing now will not completely go away. And so there's a lot of room right now, I think, for new developments in this kind of community work. And of course, there are institutions that are already doing this. Lots of grassroots Asian American organizations have been, on the ground advocating for Asians, Asian Americans, people of color for a long, 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 long time. Maybe it's taking those collaborative efforts as well. And I think for me, it's the art world, sometimes looking beyond the art world, looking beyond the museums, looking beyond what we normally think of as a way to show art. Because as we all know, people who go to museums, many people go to the Met, but a lot of people do feel intimidated by contemporary art, particularly, and they might not see it as being accessible for them. So I think having and paving the way for wider access for more people is really critical. And however we can do it, that's what I'm keen to see and to try and learn. But we're out of time. I want to thank everybody. I want to thank Sara, James, and Shahpour, and all of you. This is being recorded, so this will be up if anyone wants to see it from the beginning. And awesome that we got so many people from around the world. I appreciate all of you, and I hope all of you have a wonderful rest of the day. Thank you. Bye.